In this video, we'll study about the medulla oblongata. Before going in detail about that, first we'll see what is brainstem. This is the brainstem. It is a stalk-like part of the brain which connects the spinal cord with the forebrain. From below upward, it consists of three parts: the medulla oblongata, then you have pons and the midbrain. The midbrain is continuous above with the cerebral hemispheres, and the medulla oblongata, it is continuous below with the spinal cord. When you see the situation of the brainstem, it is located in the posterior cranial fossa. Its ventral surface lies on the clivus. Posteriorly, the pons and the medulla oblongata are separated from the cerebellum by a cavity, that is the fourth ventricle. So this is the fourth ventricle. The brainstem, like spinal cord, consists of nerve fibers and nerve cells, and most of the nerve fibers in the brainstem are arranged longitudinally in the form of tracts as in the spinal cord. But the nerve cells of the brainstem do not form a single central mass of grey matter as in the spinal cord. Rather, most of them are aggregated to form the well-defined nuclei. In addition to the well-defined tracts and the nuclei, the brainstem consists of diffuse system of nerve cells and nerve fibers which are known as the reticular formation. The central canal of the spinal cord continues upward in the lower part of the medulla oblongata, and then it widens when it moves dorsally to form the fourth ventricle. The brainstem serves the following four major functions. It provides the passage to various ascending and descending tracts that connects the spinal cord to different parts of the forebrain. It contains important autonomic reflex centers like vital centers associated with the control of respiration, heart rate and blood pressure. It contains the reticular activating system which controls the consciousness. It also contains the important nuclei of last 10 cranial nerve from 3rd to 12th cranial nerve. The bilateral destructive lesion of the brainstem are fatal because of the damage to the vital centers which control the respiration and heart rate and blood pressure. The impairment of reticular activating system leads to progressive loss of consciousness followed by stupor and coma. Next we'll see about the medulla oblongata in detail. It is the direct upward continuation of the spinal cord extending from the foramen magnum up to the lower border of the pons. It forms the lowest part of the brainstem and lies almost vertically in the anterior part of the posterior cranial fossa between the clivus and the vallicula of the cerebellum behind. The medulla is shaped like a truncated cone, hence it is also known as the bulb. The medulla oblongata measures about 3 cm in length, 2 cm breadth and 1.25 cm in thickness. The medulla contains the vital centers which are essential for the life, and they are the cardiac center, the vasomotor center and the respiratory center. The medulla provides the attachment to the last 4 cranial nerve. The lower part of the medulla, it contains, like the spinal cord, it has the central canal. In the upper part of the medulla, this canal widens and moves dorsally to form the lower part of the fourth ventricle. Thus, the medulla is divided into lower closed part and upper open part. Next we'll see the clinical correlation. Since the medulla contains the vital center, an injury to it it is usually fatal. The respiratory center is particularly vulnerable to compression and poliomyelitis and subsequent respiratory failure. The bulbar paralysis is characterized by the paralysis of the muscles supplied by the last 4 cranial nerves arising from the medulla. Next we'll see about the external features. The medulla is divided into right and the left symmetrical half by an anterior median fissure. Likewise, posteriorly you have posterior median sulcus. The anterior median fissure, it is continuous below with the corresponding fissure on the spinal cord, and above it ends into a small depression that is known as the foramen caecum at the lower border of the pons. It is interrupted in the lower part by the bundle of fibers crossing obliquely from one side to another. So this is the decussation of the pyramids. This is the posterior view. Here you can see this is the posteromedian sulcus. So this posteromedian sulcus is present in the lower part of the medulla oblongata, and it is continuous below with the posteromedian sulcus of the spinal cord. When you trace above, its lips they diverge to form the boundary of the triangular area, the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. So this is the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. So next to the anteromedian sulcus, you get the anterolateral sulcus. Likewise, you get the posterolateral sulcus, which are the direct upward continuation of the corresponding sulci of the spinal cord. The anterolateral sulcus extends along the lateral border of the pyramid, and along it emerges the rootlet of the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. This is the posterolateral sulcus. The posterolateral sulcus lies between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Along it emerges the rootlets of the 9th, 10th and 11th cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve and the accessory nerve. The anterolateral sulcus and the posterolateral sulcus with the nerve root divide the surface of each half of the medulla oblongata into anterior, posterior and lateral region. Next we'll see about the features of the anterior part or the ventral aspect of the medulla. The ventral aspect of the medulla presents the following features. First we can see the pyramid. So this is the pyramid. These are two elongated elevation, one on either side of anterior median fissure, and it is produced by the corticospinal fibers, that is the pyramidal fibers. Most of these fibers, about 75%, cross to the opposite side in the pyramidal decussation in the lower part of the medulla oblongata, then descends as the lateral corticospinal tract in the lateral white column of the spinal cord. About 20% of uncrossed fibers run downward as anterior corticospinal tract in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. The remaining 5% run downward along with the crossed fibers in the lateral white column of the spinal cord. Then you can see the olive. So this is the olive. These are oval elevation posterolateral to the pyramid, and it is produced by the underlying mass of grey matter called inferior olivary nucleus. Then you have the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve. They emerge from the anterolateral sulcus between the pyramid and the olive. Then you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The inferior cerebellar peduncle or thick bundle of fibers lying posterolateral to the olive and attach the medulla with the cerebellum. Then you have the rootlets of 9th, 10th and the 11th cranial nerve. These emerge along the posterolateral sulcus separating the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is a diagrammatic representation to show the corticospinal fibers. So these are the corticospinal fibers which are present in the pyramid, and here in the pyramidal decussation, about most of the fibers, 75%, they cross to the lateral white column and they form the lateral corticospinal tract. About 20% they remain uncrossed and they descend in the anterior white column of the spinal cord, forming the anterior corticospinal tract, and 5% they remain uncrossed and they follow the lateral corticospinal tract in the lateral white column. This is the dorsal view or the posterior view. Now we'll see the features of the posterior aspect of the medulla. The dorsal aspect of the medulla is well demarcated into a lower closed part and upper open part. Now we'll see the features of the lower closed part. The closed part on either side of the posterior median sulcus presents 3 longitudinal elevation from medial to lateral. You have the fasciculus gracilis, then you have the fasciculus cuneatus, then you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The upper end of the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, they expand to form the gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle, which are produced by the underlying nuclei of nuclei gracile and the nuclei cuneate. Another elevation presents lateral to the cuneate tubercle is the tuber cinereum. It is produced by the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. Features of the open part are: the open part of the medulla forms a lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle, which presents number of features like median sulcus, the hypoglossal triangle, the vagal triangle, and then you have the stria medullaris. We'll see in detail in the floor of the fourth ventricle later. Next we'll study about the internal structure. As in the spinal cord, the medulla also has the white matter, surrounds the central mass of grey matter, but here the grey matter is broken up into nuclei that are separated by nerve fibers. The internal structure of the medulla is well appreciated by examining its transverse sections at the following 4 levels. So what are the levels you are going to study? So first, at the level of the decussation of the pyramid or motor decussation. Second, at the level of the decussation of the medial lemniscus. Third, at the level of the olive. And fourth, at the level just inferior to the pons. So 4 levels we are going to study the internal features of the medulla oblongata. Next we'll see the features of the transverse section of the medulla at the level of pyramidal decussation or the great motor decussation. The section at this level passes through the inferior half of the medulla and it closely resembles to that of the spinal cord. So what are the important features you have to see here? You can see the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. They appear as a narrow strip-like projections from the posterior aspect of the central grey matter. Then you can see the apex of the posterior horn gets swollen up to form the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. It is an upward continuation of substantia gelatinosa in the posterior grey column of the spinal cord. Then you can see the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve. It is a bundle of fibers which caps over the nucleus of the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve. Then you can see the pyramidal decussation. About 75% of the pyramidal tract run backward and laterally across the midline to reach the lateral white column of the opposite side of the spinal cord, where they run downwards as the lateral corticospinal tract. In doing so, the anterior horn are detached from the central gray matter. This is another picture. Here you can see the two nucleus. One is the spinal nucleus of the accessory nerve, and this extends up to the fifth cervical spinal segments, and this is the supraspinal nucleus, which gives off the efferent fibers for the first cervical nerve. And this is continuous above with the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. So this continues above with the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Next we'll see what are the features at the level of sensory decussation or medial lemniscus. This section passes through the middle of the medulla. And you can see the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus, they become more pronounced and they are separated from the central gray matter. The fibers of the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, they occupy the broad posterior white column and they terminate in the nuclei. The next feature you can see is the internal arcuate fibers. These fibers arises from the cells in the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. So they are the second order sensory neuron conducting the sensation of discriminative touch, position and vibration. So these fibers course forward and medially around the central gray matter and they decussate with the corresponding fibers of the opposite side in the median plane. So this is the sensory decussation, and they then turn upward to ascend as the medial lemniscus on the opposite side close to the median plane. So when you see the decussation, the fibers from the nucleus gracilis lies more medial to the fibers from the nucleus cuneatus. The internal arcuate fibers cut off the spinal nucleus and the tract of the trigeminal nerve from the central gray matter. So they also get separated from the central gray matter. As the fibers from the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus passes forward and medially they intercross, so that the most medial fibers from the feet and the leg come to lie anteriorly and in the medial lemniscus. In the medial lemniscus, the body is represented with the head posteriorly and the feet anteriorly. The fibers of the lemniscus relay into the corresponding thalamus. Immediately dorsolateral to the cuneate nucleus lies the accessory cuneate nucleus, which receives the more lateral fibers derived from the cervical segments of the cord of the fasciculus cuneatus and gives rise to the posterior external arcuate fibers conveying the proprioceptive impulses to the cerebellum of the same side through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The separated spinal nucleus and the tract of the trigeminal nerve lie ventrolateral to the cuneate nucleus. Then you can see the lower part of the inferior olivary nucleus, and this is the pyramid which lies on either side of the anterior median fissure. This is the central gray matter. This contains the hypoglossal nerve nucleus, the dorsal nucleus of the vagus and the nucleus of tractus solitarius. The hypoglossal nerve nucleus occupies the ventromedial position close to the midline in the central gray matter. The dorsal nucleus of the vagus lies dorsolateral to the hypoglossal nucleus, and the nucleus of the tractus solitarius lies just dorsolateral to the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. Then you have the medial longitudinal bundle. So this medial longitudinal bundle lie posterior to the medial lemniscus. It is a small compact tract of nerve fibers which interconnect the third, fourth, sixth, eighth and the spinal nucleus of the 11th cranial nerve nuclei. Then you have the spinocerebellar and the lateral spinothalamic tract in the anterolateral area of lateral white column. The lateral and the anterior spinothalamic tract are very close to each other and they collectively form the spinal lemniscus. This is another picture to show at the level of the sensory decussation. So here you can see this is the nucleus gracilis, this is the nucleus cuneatus. So from this fibers, these are the internal arcuate fibers. So these fibers, they decussate. So this is the sensory decussation and they ascend as the medial lemniscus. The other features you can see in this picture, or this is the accessory cuneate nucleus and this is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and the tract, and here you can see the hypoglossal nerve nucleus, dorsal nucleus of vagus and the nucleus tractus solitarius, and this is the medial longitudinal bundle and this is the lower part of the inferior olivary nucleus, and here you can see the spinal lemniscus. The lateral and the anterior spinothalamic tract, they come very close to each other and they form the spinal lemniscus. Next we'll see the features of transverse section at the level of the olive. So this section passes through the floor of the fourth ventricle and the middle of the olive. The features are, here the central grey matter is spread over the floor of the fourth ventricle and contain the nuclei from medial to lateral. You get the hypoglossal nucleus, then you have the nucleus intercalatus, then you have the dorsal nucleus of vagus and you have the vestibular nucleus, the inferior and the medial group of vestibular nucleus. The nucleus tractus solitarius lie ventral to the vestibular nucleus. Then you have the nucleus ambiguus. It lies deep within the reticular formation and gives origin to the motor fibers of 9th, 10th and the 11th cranial nerves. On either side of the midline, in the paramedian region from dorsal to ventral, you have the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Then you have the tectospinal tract, then you have the medial lemniscus and then you have the pyramid, the corticospinal tract. Then you have the arcuate nucleus. So this is thought to be inferiorly displaced pontine nuclei and they are situated on the anteromedial aspect of the pyramid, and they receive the fibers from the cerebral cortex and send efferent fibers to the cerebellum of the opposite side through the anterior external arcuate fibers. Laterally from dorsal to ventral lie two prominent structures. So you have the inferior cerebellar peduncle and then you have the inferior olivary nucleus. The inferior cerebellar peduncle occupies posterolateral part. The inferior olivary nucleus is the largest mass of the grey matter and forms the most prominent feature in the section through the upper part of the medulla. It presents a crumbled bag-like appearance. Close to the main nucleus lie the medial and the dorsal accessory olivary nuclei. Next we'll see the features of transverse section of medulla just inferior to the pons or pontomedullary junction. So here no major changes in the distribution of the grey and the white matter in this section. Only following features are observed. Here you get the lateral vestibular nuclei This replaces the inferior vestibular nucleus of the section at the level of the olive. Then you get the dorsal and the ventral cochlear nuclei. This lie on the dorsolateral and the ventrolateral aspect of the inferior cerebellar peduncle respectively. Next we'll see the blood supply. The medulla is supplied by the two vertebral artery, the anterior and the posterior spinal arteries, then the anterior and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery and the basilar artery. This is another picture to show the area of supply of different arteries. So this is the anterior spinal artery and this is the posterior spinal artery and this is the vertebral artery. This is the area distributed by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery and this is the area supplied by the anterior inferior cerebellar artery and this is the area supplied by the vertebral artery plus the paramedian branches of the basilar artery. Next we'll see the clinical correlation. The common vascular lesions involving the medulla or the thrombosis of posterior inferior cerebellar artery and the vertebral arteries leading to lateral and the medial medullary syndrome respectively. First we'll see about the lateral medullary syndrome or the posterior inferior cerebellar artery syndrome of Wallenberg. The dorsolateral part of the medulla is supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is usually a branch of vertebral artery. This artery also supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum. The thrombosis of the posterior inferior cerebellar artery therefore affects a wedge-shaped area of dorsolateral aspect of the medulla and the inferior surface of the cerebellum, and it produces the following signs and symptoms. First, you will get the contralateral loss of pain and temperature sensation in the trunk and the limb due to the involvement of spinothalamic tract. Then, the ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature sensation over the face due to the involvement of the spinal nucleus and the tract of trigeminal nerve. Then you get the ipsilateral paralysis of muscles of the palate, pharynx and larynx due to the involvement of the nucleus ambiguous. Then there will be the ipsilateral ataxia due to the involvement of inferior cerebellar peduncle and the cerebellum. There will be giddiness due to the involvement of vestibular nuclei. There will be Horner's syndrome due to the involvement of descending sympathetic pathway in the reticular formation of medulla. Next we'll see about the medial medullary syndrome or degerens anterior bulbar syndrome. The paramedian region of the medulla is supplied by the branches of the vertebral artery. The vascular involvement or that is the ischemia of this region produces the following symptoms. The contralateral hemiplegia and paralysis of arm and the leg due to the damage of the pyramid. Then you get the ipsilateral paralysis and the atrophy of the half of the tongue due to the damage of the hypoglossal nerve. Then you get the contralateral loss of position and the vibration sense due to the damage of the medial lemniscus.